if we could, just take a moment to send our thoughts to George Floyd's family. This has to be it's the verdict's very welcome, but the grieving, both that they've had to do publicly as well as privately, hasn't ended. So maybe just a moment. Thank you. So I think I mentioned before most of you came in that everyone should be muted by now. If you're not for any reason, please go ahead and do that. I know how easily that happens. And that chat questions, you're welcome to, just send questions in, but send them to chat. Frank Garcia will be monitoring that for us and collecting them for later on for the Q&A. And if everybody wants to now go to speaker view, we might be able to do that universally. Then we'll be able to have this conversation back and forth. And I want to begin again by thanking Cloud Director Vlad Perdue for his support for this Arts and Democracy series, and the Center for Centers for their support tonight. And welcome back to the second part of our conversation with Ed Hirsch, poet and essayist and president of the Guggenheim Foundation. Ed has published 10 collections of poems, 6 prose books, and holds a MacArthur grant along with many, many prizes, but we thought we'd actually have an event instead of listing them. We're delighted to have him back at the Cloud in the wake of the publication of his newest book, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart. And this feels like the right book for a nation that's coming out from a pandemic, all the political upheaval, and so much loss of life, which we're remembering particularly today. Not just for the heartbreaking, but for the heart-waking. And for people who haven't yet bought the book, this is not your everyday anthology. This is 100 absolutely stunning poems, some very well loved, and some perhaps new discoveries, each one accompanied by a short essay. For me, they were really like meditations. They were ways to dwell longer with poems, and to see from someone who understands poetry from the inside out, talking about how they work, both on how it's crafted, as well as some of the historical or biographical or political context in which they were made, but always with this overarching love and appreciation for the poem and an ear for what's powerful in it on the poem's own terms. And tonight I wanted to start with a brief quote from Muriel Rukeyser that's in the book, who you, Ed, described as a citizen poet, and that seems very apt, and who said, "We are a people tending towards democracy at the level of hope." And it occurred to me as I was looking through many of these poems that if we don't know what it is to grieve and to love and to be human, how will we possibly know what it is, what we should ask of our institutions? And then I want to end with just 5 lines from Rukeyser's, the poem that's in the book called Poem. To construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limits of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means to wake. Thank you, Ed, for coming tonight to help us wake. You mentioned at the last Clow event that we as Americans had not yet grieved our losses. And I was wondering how poetry, how you see poetry in this particular project, this particular book, might help with that or address that in some way.
I can't remember if I said last time, but I believe that America is somewhat immature as a culture in its relationship to sorrow and grief. And that people want to divide grief up into stages and dismiss it because they're uncomfortable with it. And as soon as something terrible happens, everyone starts talking to you about healing. I'm all for healing. I'm not against it. But I believe before you can heal, you need to mourn, and you cannot forget the heartbreak. And American culture is very uncomfortable with this. And so they want to divide it in stages and get it over with. And this is one of the reasons that people go to grief groups, because they become ashamed of their feelings and their sorrows, and they start to hide them as if it's something to be embarrassed about. And so they want to go someplace where they can share their feelings with others who are not ashamed or who feel the same way they do. I don't believe the poets treat grief this way. And the poetry is a kind of more head-on, direct confrontation with different kinds of sorrows. And I wanted to bring those forward, poems that had been meaningful to me, some of them that had been with me for much of my life, others that I'd picked up along the way, and finally some that I had known more recently. Poems that spoke to me personally, but also, I believe, to some collective feelings. And that poems are made things, they're created, but they're also human documents. And here I wanted to write about them in a way, bringing them forward as an anthology, but a way to try to explain the poems better or understand them better without forgetting that they were made by human beings. I don't believe that poems are just games. I don't think it's just a way of a sort of form of fooling around, at least the poems that I've chosen. Something serious is at stake here. And I tried in writing about these poems to illuminate them as poems while remembering that they're made by human beings, often who are in some kind of agonized or painful situation.
Yeah. We had talked about looking at 4 poems from the book, starting with Akhmatova. Would you be willing to read that poem?
Sure.
Or in memory of MB?
I do. But before I do, I want to say just a word about the Miro Rukeyser poem that you quoted.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that's really remarkable about that poem and the lines that you quoted is when she talks about if you remember, reconciling ourselves with others.
Yeah.
And she also says ourselves with ourselves.
I love that moment. Yeah, that's a wonderful moment. I wonder, Eddie, do you want to just read that one in full? Because I think people really came here to hear you.
Do you remember where it is? I don't remember what page it's on.
Yes, it is on page 159. Starts on 158. Sorry, I didn't mean to catch you off. But I thought, well, if we're going to say anything about her, let's hear the whole glorious thing.
So this is a poem that Miro Rukeyser wrote during the Vietnam War, and waking up and every day trying to figure out how to live. And she called it poem, which outwardly seems kind of bland as a title, but I think also means, since poetry means poesis or making, I think it also is a kind of ambitious title because it suggests that it's something made, that there's something to do. I lived in the first century of world wars. Most mornings I would be more or less insane. The newspapers would arrive with their careless stories. The news would pour out of various devices, interrupted by attempts to sell products to the unseen. I would call my friends on other devices. They'd be more or less mad for similar reasons. Slowly I would get to pen and paper, make my poems for others unseen and unborn. In the day I would be reminded of those men and women, brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a nameless way of living, of almost unimagined values. As the lights darkened, as the lights of night brightened, we would try to imagine them, try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limits of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means, to wake.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much.
A marvelous poem, which is personal, but also has a kind of grand statement. I mean, I lived in the first century of world wars. It's very grand and large. And then she just gets down to it. Most mornings I'd be more or less insane. I think we know what this means in terms of living in America with the news every day.
Yes.
And how you take it in and how you manage it. And she's trying to figure that out, how to live. And one of the things that's subtle about the poem is it begins in the morning and it ends in night. I mean, it kind of does go through a day of, a kind of typical day in the life of Mira Rukeyser, where, she digests the news, she reads on various devices, and then slowly I would get to pen and paper. And then there's an incredible line here: make my poems for others unseen and unborn. Now that's really powerful because it suggests that she's not just writing for the people who are out there that she can't see today, but also that a poem is something that stretches out to some future reader, some future listener.
Yes.
It suggests there's someone on the other side, but that hopefulness of reaching out is towards someone that may not even be born yet.
Yes.
So there's a kind of continuity in it.
And some of those listeners in the audience right now are those unborn. We have many students here tonight who that's exactly who she's talking to. And that's
she's reaching forward. And when you read her poem, you become the audience for that poem. Yeah. You become the person that she was reaching out towards.
Lovely. Let's go from here to Akhmatova. And I didn't mean to completely get us off her, for sure.
Oh, well, that's a marvelous poem. So this is a poem that Anna Akhmatova wrote in 1940. It was not published until 1968. It's called In Memory of M.B., and it's for Mikhail Bulgakov, who is an extraordinary Russian novelist and playwright, especially, I especially recommend The Master and Margarita. So In Memory of M.B., the poem is an elegy. Here is my gift. Not roses on your grave, not sticks of burning incense. You lived aloof, maintaining to the end your magnificent disdain. You drank wine and told the wittiest jokes and suffocated inside stifling walls. Alone, you let the terrible stranger in and stayed with her alone. Now you're gone, and nobody says a word about your troubled and exalted life. Only my voice, like a flute, will mourn at your dumb funeral feast. Oh, who would have believed that half-crazed I, sick with grief for the buried past, I, smoldering on a slow fire, having lost everything and forgotten all, would be fated to commemorate a man so full of strength and will and bright inventions, who only yesterday, it seems, chatted with me, hiding the tremor of his mortal pain. That's translated by Stanley Kunitz and Max Hayward.
Gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Yeah, what struck me about this is so moving, and Akhmatova is so amazing, is that point where she's really emphasizing the conditions, that she doesn't talk about his work. She talks about how he's handling himself under what's basically the political pressure. Some people may not know about this, though you can somehow figure out from the dates, what the kinds of pressure, why there's this silence, why there's no funeral for this great writer, and why Akhmatova feels she's the only mourner, and she's doing it privately and alone. But maybe you want to say more about it, some of the political situation.
I mean, it was Stalinist Russia, and he had become a non-person. That's why she doesn't mention his whole name and just uses his initials. And that's why she goes, here's my gift, not roses on your grave, nor sticks of burning incense. There's no public funeral. She speaks to him directly here. This is her poem is going to be her gift because there's no public mourning for him because he's not a person anymore that's recognized by the state. One thing that might be worth pointing out to people who hopefully will never live in an authoritarian society is that every single authoritarian society has very strong dictates on what people are supposed to write about and what they're not supposed to write about. And in the face of political societies like this, where the subject is prescribed and the view you're supposed to take is prescribed, writing about the personal life is a political act. Writing about your own experience or valuing your own experience is a political act. And it is a kind of act of resistance, even though it doesn't seem like one. Because you're saying the private life matters, and what I feel matters, and my memorial for this person matters. And what you have here is a kind of crude state and a sophisticated person. And so you get a picture of Bulgakov as a witty person, an extraordinarily clever person, someone who had, quote, magnificent disdain, but who still sort of can't travel and is still in a kind of in the lockjaws of the state. What I find very moving about every poem, every elegy is also about the person writing it as well as the person who's being memorialized. And what I find especially moving about this is Akhmatova's recognition that really she's not the person who should be writing this poem, and that he's the more sophisticated one, but nonetheless, she's the one who's called upon to do it. Yeah. And that nobody says a word about his life, and therefore it falls upon her to say it. And for all her limitations, her sense of being half crazed, her sense of being sick with grief, she nonetheless takes up the traditional role of the elegist. And here she relies on the flute, which is the instrument of grief in Greek culture and traditional elegies. And, you know, only my voice like a flute will mourn your dumb funeral feast, that she's the one who will remember.
Yes, and too, Ed, the way that the I comes in, even though she describes herself as a flute, and of course the language is gorgeous, but the way the I comes in feels like keening to me. So she's enacting that, like I, you know.
I sick with grief, I smoldering on a fire. I agree. There's a kind of incantatory quality about it. This is a case where I think a private grief becomes a public woe. Which is how we got to the subject that we were of tonight's discussion. That is, that it's bringing forward this person and refusing to let him be forgotten.
Yes.
And the poem, there's a kind of gap between the in memory of and then the direct address to him in the present tense.
Yes.
I find it really moving that you may not be the one who is best suited to remember certain things, but you're the only one who can do it.
Yes.
It's not that you're it's for any of us, it's not that we're the perfect minders of the store. It's not that we're perfectly well trained. It's not that we know more than anyone else. It's that there's no one else to do it. And if you don't remember your life, if you don't memorialize the people that you care about, it's not as if someone else is going to come along and do that.
Yes.
And so that's, I think, her position here.
Beautiful.
And then her poem was in the same position that Bulgakov was in, because it was written in 1940, but wasn't published for nearly 30 years.
Yes.
It stayed in the drawer.
Yes, with a lot of pressure, because her son was incarcerated, right? Was put into prison, and her ex-husband was killed. So she's also in this netherland of not knowing what's going to happen for her. But certainly her work is not being published unless she's willing to write for the state, and she doesn't.
She did have a couple of moments where she did, because the pressure was on her so tremendously. There was also moments where she was rehabilitated enough during the siege of Leningrad to go on the public radio to try and rally people. But in general, as you know, that was the moment where she was writing Requiem and standing outside her son's prison and trying to memorialize what was happening in Stalinist Russia.
Let's take a look at Gerald Stern, but I want to say, as you're finding that page, that that little moment, those little vignettes, that's one of the, for me, the delights of the book, is that you can come in here and be an absolute beginner to poetry, and the way you dwell with the poems, it gets all these avenues in. and you're learning things without realizing you're learning things. But you can also be someone who, has read a lot of Akhmatova and I adore Akhmatova, but some of those things like, oh, she did the broadcast during Siege of Leningrad. Oh, I didn't realize she was rehabilitated that far. And so we're also, it's like there's always this other level, to know. And I appreciate it. I appreciate all that.
I try to use biography in ways that are helpful
Yeah.
without reducing the poem, but I believe the poems have a story, and they have a backstory of how they came to be written. And that can be very interesting to read about, and it places it in a particular moment in time, without diminishing the fact that it's a created thing.
Yeah, you balance all that. Should we look at the dancing?
So I wanted to read this poem by Gerald Stern, one, because I like it terrifically, but also because it speaks to our subject, because it looks like it's a private poem. It looks like it's just about his own moment with his family, nostalgically remembering something. I mean, you'll see he starts out in a kind of thrift shops looking for stuff. And that catapults him back into his past, to when he was 20 years old and living in Pittsburgh with his parents. And then you'll see the poem turns and connects to something historical. The dancing. In all these rotten shops, in all this broken furniture and wrinkled ties and baseball trophies and coffee pots, I've never seen a post-war Philco with the automatic eye, nor heard Ravel's Bolero the way I did in 1945 in that tiny living room on Beechwood Boulevard, nor danced as I did then, my knives all flashing, my hair all streaming, my mother red with laughter, my father cupping his left hand under his armpit, doing the dance of old Ukraine, the sound of his skin half drum, half fart, the world at last a meadow, the three of us whirling and singing, the three of us singing and falling, as if we were dying, as if we could never stop. In 1945, in Pittsburgh, beautiful, filthy Pittsburgh, home of the evil melons, 5,000 miles away from the other dancing, in Poland and Germany. Oh God of mercy, oh wild God.
Thank you, Ed. So to say something, open this for us.
The poem turns in a remarkable way, I think. He's going through the thrift shops, and he's saying, I didn't hear it like this, I didn't hear it like that. And then he's back, and you have a moment of ecstasy where, his father is going like this, and they're dancing around. And the world is becoming, ecstatic threesome there on Beechwood Boulevard in Pittsburgh. It's very specifically located in a place. And you think that's what it's a poem about. And the world is being transformed into some kind of paradise, the world at last a meadow. The three of us whirling and singing, three of us screaming and falling, as if we were dying, as if we could never stop. And here's the moment where I think the poem turns, where he pinpoints it and goes, in 1945. So now we're placing this at a moment in time. It's not just I was 20 and I was in my family's living room, we're dancing around, my parents and me. Because now he's in Pittsburgh. And then, it's a sort of, he describes Pittsburgh in this double way, beautiful, filthy. And then, in my opinion, he can't resist. He takes a shot at the evil melons, which isn't really maybe even entirely appropriate, but he can't help it. He's like so belligerent about, the Pittsburgh that he grew up in and what those corporate overlords were like who dominated Pittsburgh. But then here's where it becomes, I think, a public poem, 5,000 miles away from the other dancing. And now we understand dancing in a somewhat different way, because dancing here is literally dancing with his parents, but the other dancing is something else, something maybe a little more metaphorical. 5,000 miles away from the other dancing in Poland and Germany, that is in Europe, where there have been concentration camps. And now this dancing stands for the liberation of the camps. And then it's something wild let loose that seems almost like a prayer, because he goes, "Oh God of mercy, oh wild God." And it just opens up into this other sort of prayerful dimension. And so last time, if you remember, we were talking about the accesses in poems between the historical and the metaphysical. And this poem has an access that becomes historical, 1945, in Poland and Germany. And then it turns upward to something else, "Oh God of mercy," which is, I think, somewhat ironic, and refers to the Jewish prayer, "Merciful God." Is God merciful? Well, yes and no. And then, "Oh wild God," God himself seems to be out of control in this sort of wild dance. So the reason, I mean, I love this poem, but the reason I wanted to bring it and talk about it was because it looks like it's a private poem. It looks as if it's going to be, and I'm all for that. I think that's fine. If it were just a poem about dancing with your parents and the world becoming a meadow, that's an extraordinary thing in itself. But this poem does something else, which becomes a poem. It becomes a poem of history. And that the personal poem has a kind of historical awareness. And that's what I found also true in the Akhmatova poem. And that's why I saw the continuity. I mean, the feelings are different. Hers is a lament. His is a kind of wild ecstasy and sorrow. But the move of something that's private, that has public consequences, or that's situated at a historical moment, seemed to me an interesting move in poetry. So that the line that we draw between what's private and what's public, what's personal and what's historical, I think is more permeable than we let on. And that's why I'm glad we hadn't planned it, but that's why I'm glad you brought up the Rukeyser, because the Rukeyser poem is personal, but she's also right. I mean, she's sitting down to work, she's having her coffee, she's reading the papers, she's on the device, but she's also paying attention to what's going on in the culture. And so here she's really writing, and I think she was clearer than almost anyone about this, as a citizen poet, as someone who cares about her country.
Yeah.
And it was good to bring that up, because we also wanted to say something about Adrian Rich.
That's what I was going to say. Perfect transition to talk about Adrian Rich, who I think could also be described in certain ways as a citizen poet. So, so this is Dedications from an Atlas of the Difficult World. Ed, did you want to read this, or did you said you didn't want me to read it? What do you want to do?
I think it'd be great if you read it.
Okay. So, Dedications. I know you are reading this poem late, before leaving your office of the one intense yellow lamp spot in the darkening window, in the lassitude of a building faded to quiet, long after rush hour. I know you are reading this poem standing up in a bookstore far from the ocean on a gray day of early spring, faint flakes driven across the plain's enormous spaces around you. I know you are reading this poem in a room where too much has happened for you to bear, where the bedclothes lie in stagnant coils on the bed and the open valise speaks of flight, but you cannot leave yet. I know you are reading this poem as the underground train loses momentum, and before running up the stairs toward a new kind of love your life has never allowed. I know you are reading this poem by the light of the television screen, where soundless images jerk and slide while you wait for the newscast from the Intifada. I know you're reading this poem in a waiting room of eyes met and unmeeting, of identity with strangers. I know you are reading this poem by fluorescent light in the boredom and fatigue of the young who are counted out, count themselves out at too early an age. I know you are reading this poem through your failing sight, the thick lens enlarging these letters beyond all meaning, yet you read on because even the alphabet is precious. I know you are reading this poem as you pace beside the stove warming milk a crying child on your shoulder, a book in your hand, because life is short and you too are thirsty. I know you are reading this poem, which is not in your language, guessing at some words while others keep you reading, and I want to know which words they are. I know you are reading this poem, listening for something, torn between bitterness and hope, turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. I know you are reading this poem because there is nothing else left to read there where you have landed, stripped as you are. So,
Lovely, thank you.
you're welcome. So, open this for us.
So this is the 13th section of a long poem that Adrienne Rich called An Atlas of the Difficult World. And it's very unusual because this is called dedications, and the dedication comes at the end rather than the beginning of the poem. And it's specifically a poem, and Atlas of the Difficult World is one of my favorite poems by Adrienne Rich. It's specifically a poem about, she says self-consciously that she's writing it as a citizen poet, and how do I love my country in a time of war? Which is a question that all of us have often. How do we love our country at all? Because we're so perpetually at war. How do we love our country that's a racist country? How do we love our country when things happen in our country that we don't approve of? Rich tries to grapple with this in An Atlas of the Difficult World. And in this in the last section, she identifies 13 different readers. And each one of the readers is both a single person and a kind of, in my opinion, a representative, a sort of someone who stands in for the whole. And there's a kind of confidence in it about a readership that many of us don't feel. She feels sure that she's sending this poem out, and then she goes, I know you are reading this poem. And she repeats this again and again. I know you are reading this poem. It's not like, I hope you will read this poem. I feel you should read this poem. It's, I know you are reading this poem. And then she pinpoints 13 different readers. And each one she places in a very specific place, a very particular reader. Now, one of the things that's odd about this is it took me a while to see this, to read it, because Adrienne Rich was such an explicit feminist. And for so many years, she excluded men from her poetry and from her concern, that it takes a moment to see that Atlas of the Difficult World is somewhat different. And that when you actually read this poem closely, the people that are in it are not identified by gender. That any one of these people could be a she or a he or a they. It doesn't say, I know you are reading this poem as a woman, or I know you're reading this poem as a man, or as a, it just doesn't say, even though it seems to. I know you are carrying a baby on your shoulder, but it doesn't say, I know you are breastfeeding this baby. I mean, in other words, it really is gender neutral, this way to include either, a whole range of people. One of the things that when you read the poem more closely, that you might not get when you first hear it, is she pinpoints each reader that she goes through in dedications, that the readers specifically go down the ladder of privilege. That the people are, that none of them are tremendously well off, but each reader is further away, more isolated, and more impoverished, more of an outsider as she reaches further and further away. So someone is reading the book, her poem in a bookstore, presumably because the person can't afford to buy it. Someone is reading it when they're in watching TV with the sound off, and so forth. I don't want to take the time to read through every single person, but every one of them is in a position of more and more deprivation.
Yes.
And at the end, the person has been stripped the most. I know you are reading this poem because there's nothing else left to read there where you have landed, stripped as you are. In an interview with Bill Moyers, Adrienne Rich said that she was first of all thinking of someone with AIDS. but that sort of, in a way, stripped, the reference is stripped. It's
Yes.
whatever you can think of as someone who's been stripped down totally.
Yes.
And it reaches that far point to dedicate this poem to that person. So this seems to me a kind of Whitman-esque gesture of inclusion to find people wherever they are. And I will just point out, none of them are in the university. It's not an academic enterprise. It's like trying to find, I mean, I don't think we're against people in universities. I don't mean to say anything like that. I'm not suggesting anything anti-intellectual. What I'm suggesting is that she's trying to find people out there in the world and believes that poetry can speak to these people, can reach them, that it is part of the project of an American poet as a citizen to speak to other Americans or otherwise.
This might be a good time to pick up our last poem before we go to questions and answers, which is Yusef Kumignaka's The African Burial Ground, because that's also talking about, I think Stern's reaching, across geography at the same point in time, and we see Rich reaching to all these different folks. You're going to see Kumignaka in a certain way reach back to the dead and make them alive.
The historical context of this is that there was an African burial ground that had been completely lost in development over the centuries, and that it was uncovered by some project on the Lower East Side, where developers went out to develop this project and found this burial ground dating to the pre-colonial era of Africans. And so you'll see at the end of the poem, the person is walking by the burial ground, which is sunk down but has been unearthed. They came as Congo, Guinea, and Angola, feet tuned to rhythms of a thumb piano. They came to work fields of barley and flax, livestock, stone and slab, brick and mortar, to make wooden barrels, some going from slave to servant and half-dreaming. They built tongue and grew, wedged into their place in New Amsterdam. Decades of seasons changed the city from Dutch to York, and dream-footed hard work rattled their bones. They danced Ashanti. They lived and died, shrouded in cloth and cedar and pine coffins. Trinity Church owned them in 6.5 acres of sloping soil. Before speculators arrived, grass and weeds overtook what was most easily forgotten, and tannery shops drained there. The descendants and newcomers shoulder rock and heave loose gravel into the landfill before building crews came, their guitars and harmonicas chasing away ghosts at lunch break. Soon footsteps of lower Manhattan strutted overhead, back and forth between old denials and new arrivals, going from major to minor pieties, always on the go. The click of heels, the tap of a drum awaking the dead.
Beautiful. Now this is a poem, Ed, where I love Yusef Kumignaka, but I wouldn't necessarily have loved this poem if your meditation on it hadn't given me that extra moment to linger. I think it felt like it was written for an occasion. I'm not sure it was, even though I know he wrote it, he read it when the burial ground was made into a national monument. And so I think I would have said, oh, this sounds like this is written for an occasion. I don't know. But then, because you were having us pay attention to the dancing, the movement, the everything, and then the end, all this focus on the feet, and then the steps over the top when it seems as though we've buried this history. We have buried this history. But there we are, you can walk over it, and he even says strut over it, but you're wakening these dead. You're not going to keep them down. And the poem then becomes this sort of enacting of like, look at all the action, look at all the aliveness, they're back. But I think this is one of the real gifts of the book too, is to let us stay just a moment longer and let it resonate all the ways it wants to resonate. So it's beautiful.
Well, thank you. I think the end of this poem is subtle, and you might miss it. where he goes, I mean, people are walking over Lower Manhattan, strutted overhead, back and forth between old denials and new arrivals, going from major to minor penalties, always on the go. The click of heels, the tap of a drum awaking the dead. And the use of the drum there is not accidental. It's the drum is the major instrument of African music and poetry. And he refers here to kind of talking drums. And you go all the way back to they came as Congo, Guinea, and Angola. I mean, they came not from that place, they came as that place. And they danced, and they brought their culture with them, but then they were forced to work. And there's an incredible history being condensed here as these people move from slave to servant to half freeman. That they move, I mean, people forget about slavery in New York, but it was there. And it wasn't just a Southern institution. The peculiar institution was in the North too. It's baked into the history. And here he refers to the slavery and then the servitude and then Jim Crow. So, I mean, what kind of freedom is that as America developed? I think he creates a transition over time here, but there's a kind of sorrowfulness about this, but also a kind of awaking, not just the mournfulness, but also the culture that people brought with them.
We should probably go to Q&A now, Ed, because I can see that we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A. Frank, you want to usher that in? Thanks.
Sure, happy to. So our first question is from Isabella Benson, and it's a two-part question. And the first, is there anyone in particular, Ed, that inspired you to write this book? And the second question is, what is it about your work, your life, the research, the writing, that leaves you fulfilled each and every day?
The first part is, was there a person who inspired me to write this book?
Yes.
I mean, there are many people that I admire, and there are many poems, tremendous number of poems here, but I can't say that there was a single person who inspired me to write it. My own sorrow and my own reaching out to other poems is what inspired me to write it. That is, in my own grief, I've turned to other poets and other poems that have helped me. And I wanted to try and share that experience of what these poems have meant to me and to help bring them forward in their fuller presence. So I can't say that there was any one person that encouraged me in particular to write this book or inspired me. But I love the way that Dante calls on Virgil at the beginning of the Inferno, and I think of trying to call on other poets and other poems that have helped me in my life. And so maybe that the answer to that is that each one of these poems has been a way to help myself. And to the second part of the question is, what makes me feel better every day? Is that?
Or I'd say, what is it? Is there an aspect of your work that you wake up to and you feel fulfilled each day by getting a chance to do it or write it or be part of it?
Totally. This has been a puzzle during the pandemic because I'm aware of the larger griefs, but I find it's hard to explain the elation that I feel in trying to get to the bottom of how poems have moved me. And that, I mean, sometimes I'm blank. I also have what one psychoanalyst called inner muteness, and that's a kind of desolation. But when I'm not faced with inner muteness, when I'm faced with other poems, and in this case, writing about poems that have been meaningful to me, I found, even no matter how sorrowful the poem, I found it encouraging to try and reach out and understand it better. Now, there were times when 100 seemed like a lot. And I confess that there was a moment when I called my editor and said, what do you say to 50 poems to break your heart? Because writing about 100 poems was somewhat daunting. But once I went back to the individual poems and continued to widen the scope, I found it really heartening to do, and it gave me something to do with myself. And I feel having a place to place your grief, to place your feeling, to transform your anxiety is for me helpful. And so I feel as if I'm making or doing something. And in those days, not every single day, I'm sure I'm lost like other people on some days. But when I can, throwing myself into the project is for me exciting and fulfilling.
Oh, thank you, Ed. So that brings me to Elizabeth McCulloch's question. She says, you spoke about how America is not good at grieving. What advice do you have, especially for younger Americans, for sitting in the discomfort of mourning rather than trying to move past it quickly?
I think you've put it very well yourself. This is that instead of pretending that we should just pretend that we don't have these feelings, I think it's better to live with them and to dwell them and to not be ashamed of them. And I mean, your feelings do change over time. They do not stay the same. It is not static. But in my opinion, the only way out of grief is through it. And the people that I know who've tried not to grieve when they've lost things and just tried to go on about their daily business, sooner or later it catches up with them. Like psychically, you can't actually do it. It actually will come and find its vengeance on you. So I don't have any practical advice except that not being ashamed of the feeling and dwelling in the feeling. This is something that's really we're gonna have to reckon with as a nation. Because everyone's been so busy politicizing and fighting about the pandemic and yet a tremendous number of people have lost people that they've loved and have not been able to have rituals, have not been able to have ceremonies. I mean, the devastation has been tremendous. And as a country, we haven't reckoned with it at all because everyone's been very busy about fighting whether we should wear masks or not and whether we should stay closed or open up. I mean, but when you have someone in government in Texas saying that it's okay to sacrifice certain old people so the economy can get going, I wonder what kind of country we're living in. And so I think keeping human beings in front of us and remembering that human beings live in this country and that we mourn for them when they pass, it would be a step towards maturation in the culture.
That brings me to, there's a comment and a question from the poet Gary Whited. And his comment, I would say, is grief where the historical and the metaphysical can touch and cross and inform each other, but only if we open to it and touch it and let ourselves be touched by it. And isn't this one of the tasks, if not the central task, at the heart of making poems? To enact the touching of and being touched by grief, our own personally or ours publicly or both.
I would say that, I mean, that's really a rhetorical question. I think it's so astute as a comment and a perception. The only thing I would say about this, that everything in that statement is accurate and true. The only thing I would say is that lamentation is not the only feeling, and it's not the only feeling in poetry. That whenever there's never been a culture without poetry, first of all. And in every culture that there has been poetry, there has been a poetry of lamentation and grief, of easing the passage of the dead to the other world. But there is also a poetry of celebration and joy. And that these are, in my opinion, flip sides of the same thing. That is, you mourn because the world is passing. You celebrate what we have in the world that is passing. And so I would say that, yes, everything that Gary says is accurate, but I would also say you could substitute the word joy, and that would also be true. That there's a kind of ecstatic element that is also a rhapsodic element that is also part of life and also part of poetry. I mean, people reach for poetry for funerals, but they also reach for poetry at weddings and births. So I would say that I'm heavily involved, and I've written this book, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, about grief and sorrow, and believe that as an enduring feeling in poetry. But I don't want to suggest that it's the only one, because I think that it's not all sorrow and lamentation. There are, for example, there are love poems of brokenheartedness, and really great ones. But there are also love poems of attainment. They're also, it's not all longing and refusal. There are also poems of beloved attainment, which I rejoice in when that happens in a poet. So
I'm also thinking too, Eddie, even the poems we were talking about tonight, in a certain way, it's interesting that, of course, we're talking about the grief aspect, but without like hopes in your country, that disappointment really doesn't have any ground. If you didn't have an idea about what democracy was, you wouldn't be heartbroken about it, that it's not delivering on what you hope it would deliver. If, that stern, you see absolutely that sense of piercing through, like in the middle of a joy, suddenly you have this piercing understanding that at the same time there's great suffering.
it's
So
also true of the Rukeyser and the Rich poems.
Yes.
There's a dream about the country there.
Well, then maybe that's a time to bring in a question that was already here about the Rich poem. Ed, you've said before in other contexts that some political poems need to be written for their time and for the poet's conscience, but they will not live beyond that time, and others will. And the Rich poem seems to bring that up in a particular way, because it's written as part of a larger work of political engagement at a very specific time in American history, but none of those are mentioned explicitly in the poem, and yet it has this independent life somehow beyond both. And wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. I mean, look, I wish I had a how-to on how to write a political poem that will be lasting. I don't have the answer. I don't have the formula for that. But I believe that Rich has achieved something here. I think Rukeyser achieved something there. It's not true of all their work, but it is true of these poems, and that there is a quality of this. This Rich poem is not entirely dependent on the fact that America is in the Iraq War. Even though that it is written at that moment, and that is the shadow of it, and I think it is related to that. I mean, Rich, as you know, dated all of her poems because she wanted to pinpoint them at historical moments in time. But I think the situation of the readers that she's finding is still very much relevant today. I mean, okay, we may not have a reader who's suffering during the first Palestinian intifada, which the reader is in that poem, but we still have, sadly, the same insane Palestinian situation. And so you still have people that are suffering from this kind of exclusion. And I believe that we don't have the same AIDS crisis that we had. And so the reader at the end, there may not be suffering from AIDS, although people still do. But the strip situation that the person is in still seems to me tremendously relevant, because certainly there are plenty of people in that situation who are suffering from all kinds of places of difference.
Eddie, I was going to ask, excuse me for interrupting, but I realize we're getting close to the hour. The time's flying by, and I know you've very generously offered to stay and do some more Q&A, but I know some students have to go to another event. And I wondered if you'd be willing to read yet another poem, which is absolutely gorgeous, but it felt right for this event, and particularly at Boston College, which is Evan Boland's Quarantine. And that's on page 363.
You want to mention it because Evan was with us?
Yeah, because Evan and Kevin Young were there at the very beginning with the Klaus series, and she's passed on now. I don't think we'll ever stop missing her in poetry and personally. And so this was based, maybe you want to say, Eddie, this particular poem was based on a historical event.
Evan so Yvonne was with us when we talked about politics and poetry, and specifically spoke about the situation in Ireland and the contract between the poets and the readers in Ireland, which she felt was much closer than the contract in American poetry, and that Irish poets were much more connected to this society. But Yvonne, throughout her work, this poem is called Quarantine, so it especially resonates with us. But she wrote it about the famine, and she wrote a series of poems about the famine as a watershed moment in Irish history, which she called a powerful and once and for all disruption of any kind of heroic history. And that she felt that Ireland had not wholly come to terms with what had happened during the famine. And so she wrote a series of poems to try and bring that historical event into the present, and also to bring forward ordinary people who had been forgotten or left out of history. And that for her especially meant women. That history, Irish history, had been told as a series of heroic narratives, especially of resisting the English. But that ordinary people, especially ordinary women, people who'd had domestic lives, had also suffered and were forgotten by Irish poetry. And so she tried to stage a kind of intervention. This is called Quarantine. In the worst hour of the worst season, of the worst year, of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking. They were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that, west and north, until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There's only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847. Also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved.
Thank you, Eddie. I've got a lovely note from Rosanna Warren in the chat saying, I mainly want to thank Eddie for making this magnanimous book, this gathering of hearts. So all I'll say to that is thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'll say to that Rosanna has a wonderful poem in the book, an extraordinary poem called Simile, which is, it looks like it's going to be about a literary device, but it's a remarkable poem about her mother. And becomes a kind of elegy for her mother. It's really an extraordinary poem, and I was thrilled to include it. So
lovely. So we'll go back to gallery view. People that need to go, thank you so much for being here tonight. And if you want to unmute yourselves and applaud Eddie, please do so.
Thanks, everybody. Hey, Roseanne, I see you. Hey, Jim, I see you. So nice to see everyone. Jeff, Gary, good to see you.
Frank, do you want to unmute everybody now? Anybody, or anybody who wants to, can they unmute themselves? Good.
I'm going to try to, yeah.
Great. So were there any questions that didn't get a chance to be asked? I think you had quite a few, Frank.
Yes. Okay. Now everyone can unmute if they would like to. One of the questions that had been sent in advance is, what advice do you have for writing about grief mid-pandemic and mid-civil rights movement?
Well, I don't think we can wait till the end. I mean, I don't think we can wait for everything to end before we decide it's time to write about it. I think you write from where you are. And I mean, I would say that wherever you are in the middle of pandemic, of course, you won't have a full view of the whole pandemic, but we won't for many years to have a full sense of that. I would say that you always write pinpointed from where you are at any moment. And I think that this particular moment, if you don't write, if you're inclined to write poems and you don't write the poem of this moment, then you might write a different poem later, but you will not be able to write the mid-pandemic poem. So you have a view and an access now that you won't have later. I mean, this is always a question, for example, about elegies. Like, how soon after someone dies should you write a poem? And what kind of poem does one write? And there are losses and gains, depending on what you're able to do. If you write the poem earlier, you're in a kind of crazed state that is very immediate. You lose a certain kind of tranquility, I would say, and a certain perspective, but you get a kind of wildness. And later, you lose that wildness, but you get a kind of a perspective that you can't get when you're inside the feeling in the same way. So Wordsworth was very smart about this when he spoke about emotion recollected in tranquility, because what he suggests is not that the feeling is tranquil, but that tranquility is able to return you to the initial feeling, but with a later consciousness and perspective. But I would say if you're in the middle of a pandemic and you're feeling something about where you are, there's some to be gained for writing those poems. I mean, it wouldn't have been good for Frank O'Hara to wait 3 years later and write his lunch poems then. There's kind of immediacy in them and spontaneity in them that meant that they really had to be written on the spot. Whereas other kinds of poems are written over a long perspective. I think it just really depends on where you are and what kind of poem you want to write.
You know, one poet that might illustrate exactly what you're saying is the question is about Joy Harjo. If you'd be willing to say something about her role as poet laureate, and she's speaking, of course, for a community that, despite hundreds of years of history, is still very much in the middle of all of that suffering and that history.
Well, I think that, first of all, when the histories of American poetry have been very, very inaccurate. When they pretend that American poetry starts with the colonials or the Puritans. American poetry goes all the way back to the Paleolithic, with Native Nations peoples who were here for centuries and centuries. And I think Joy brings an awareness of the long place of Native peoples in America and the agonized history, and that you never can forget, reading her poems and reading her New Norton anthology, that America was founded on a genocide, and that genocide is ever present for some people and should be remembered by all of us too. So I think Joy brings great awareness to this living experience, that the oldest, greatest continuity of Americans is with Native Nations peoples who identify themselves not as Native American, but by their tribe. And I think that her consciousness about this and the work she's done on behalf of this has been, and the poem that I write about in the book about her, is really helpful to our awareness as Americans.
Thanks. And you touching this question of genocide, it brings back into view the Stirred poem and the way that at the end it's touching the Holocaust. And the question is, if the poem is in some sense even stronger because it only glancingly touches the Holocaust at the end, and if there may be strategies in there for writing about truly monumental horrors and griefs and heartbreaks, that they're sort of like a poetics of telling it slant, touching it.
There's something to be said for telling it slant, and there's something to be said for telling it directly. I mean, I think that What you don't want is to pretend you were somewhere that you weren't. And I think the power of the Stern poem is that what looks like two families turn out to be one. And that one branch of the family's in Pittsburgh and another branch of the family's being liberated in Poland and Germany. And that he writes about this glancingly. There are other Holocaust poems in 100 poems that I'm not reading or talking about that are much more direct. There's a poem by Primo Levi called Shema, which is basically a curse upon you if you forget these people. There's a poem by the Yiddish poet Kadya Molodovsky called Merciful God, which she wrote in 1946, which is a Holocaust poem, if you can believe it, that's actually kind of has a kind of joke in it. The joke is, the Jews are the chosen people. God, choose someone else for a change. We're tired of your choosing us. We want to give up our genius. We want to give it up. Let's choose someone else to do something from now on. There's an extraordinary poem by Anthony Heck called The Book of Yolik, which is a sestina, which starts out in a memory of his going to a camp when he was a young boy, and ends up telling the story of a Polish boy named Yolik, who was murdered in Poland. So I think that the Stern poem and the Heck poem are models for how to write an American poem about the Holocaust. But it's not the only way. Indirection is one way, and it can be very smart in terms of the experience, but it's not the only way. When you read the Primo Levi poem, you'll see it's a curse. And when you see the Kadya Molodovsky poem, you'll see that her trauma is real, because she's writing it in 1946, just when she's finding out that all her family members in Poland are being killed. But she presents it as a prayer to God, a kind of ironic one.
It's interesting too, Eddie, that you do this. I just love your reading of Surprised by Joy and Patient as the Wind, Wordsworth, and that moment where he turns, right, and realizes his daughter's not there. He goes to tell her. And I think Stern echoes some of that feel, that you're going on and you're having this great moment, and then suddenly you're sort of pierced by the knowledge, even if it's in retrospect, that, oh my God, all this intolerable sorrow is also there.
That's a good point. The Stern poem, it's as if the moment of remembering 1945, like this happened in 1945, that catapults him over. In the Wordsworth poem, which is extremely clever as a poem, but also very moving, is that in the turn in the Petrarchan sonnet, I mean, the story of it is he sees something that's exciting to him, something marvelous that he wants, and he's sort of surprised. Joy is one of Wordsworth's favorite words. He used it like 150 times in his poetry. And he's surprised by something marvelous. And at the very moment of the Petrarchan sonnet where the sonnet turns, he turns to his companion, his daughter, who turns out not to be there. And the agon of that is that he'd forgotten that she had died in his excitement. And then he's filled with remorse, filled with guilt. How could he possibly have forgotten, even for a moment, that his daughter has died? And there's a kind of revelation in that that's also a shock, and that Wordsworth's great poem of joy is also his great poem of sorrow. But also there's a kind of revelation about life, of something that's true, that time does go on, and we do re-experience or experience things again, and that we get pulled back by life into joy, and that we're surprised by it. And therefore we somehow feel guilty for then having left behind the people who no longer change, who no longer move, who are not with us anymore. And Wordsworth enacts this duality in a remarkable way in a very condensed space of 14 lines.
That links, I think, to the question about one of the poems you haven't read, also the Marie Howe's poem. Partly because of the way, the piercing of the pain and the everyday lifeness of that poem, but also because it it's a poem that wasn't necessarily written to be political, but was so taken up by the community devastated by AIDS. So I wondered if you could say something about that way of being a political poem.
Well, I mean, we're talking about Marie Howe's poem, What the Living Do, which I think is really an extraordinary poem. And it's about her brother who died of AIDS. And she tried for months to write an elegy for him and found that she couldn't do it. And so she posed it. She ended up posing the poem as a letter to him since they had written to each other so often. And the poem becomes, it's in the guise of a letter. And therefore takes on this, has this long history of the epistle poem or the letter poem. But it's a kind of fictive letter poem because her brother is not alive. And one of the things when you read this remarkable poem of hers, What the Living Do, is it becomes a meditation on what the dead don't do and what the living do. And even though she says it's a letter to her brother, and I quote the lines in which she says that from an interview, it's very striking to me the ways in which it's not a letter. Because you go, well, if you're really writing a letter to your brother who's died, wouldn't you say how mom is doing? Wouldn't you they have I think 10 or 11 brothers and sisters. Wouldn't you mention what Jimmy is doing now and what Rose has got a job? I mean, you'd think that in a real letter to your brother, you would tell him everything that's going on in the family. But in fact, she doesn't do that at all. In fact, the poem is pointed in a different way. And that's that what she writes about to her brother is that daily life is going on, and that she's walking down the street, and that she sees her own reflection in the window, and that the wind is blowing her, and that you get a cup of coffee in the day, and that there's a kind of quotidian life going on that seems both appalling and exciting, and that this is the reality, that what the living do is what the dead don't do. And the poem ends, I am alive, I remember you. And it's not that different in that sense from the Wordsworth. I am alive, I remember you. And so you bring your brother with you in your life, but your brother he's there and he's not there. And she's sort of telling her brother what she's doing, but what she's doing is getting coffee and walking and spilling groceries on the street and going home.
I wanted to mention too that Frank's put the connection for people who don't know the poem, and students of mine I can see here, he's put a link in the chat if you want to follow that too and see what Eddie's talking about.
Thanks,
Ed,
Frank.
are we wearing you out?
Not at all, but I might be wearing everyone else out.
Do you have time for another question?
Yeah, I've got time for 98 more poems.
So maybe one question to bring us back around to the more explicitly political. You said earlier, and you say in your book, you describe Rookheiser as a citizen poet, which seems perfectly apt. And yet in some way, all citizens all poets are citizens of somewhere. So what distinctively do you mean about her or about that idea of the citizen poet?
I would say that the citizen poet, what I mean by it is someone who is addressing social concerns and writing as a citizen. The way that, say, William Meredith did late in his life, that the poem is pitched at a certain social level, that where the poet stands in, I mean, of course, we're all citizens, but in many poems, the poet isn't necessarily writing as a citizen. That is someone engaged in the politics of his or her nation. For example, I'm extremely enthusiastic about Stanley Kunitz's poem, Halley's Comet, which is an extraordinary poem calling to his father. He catapults himself back into childhood in this poem when Halley's Comet seemed like it was going to wipe out the world. And at the end of the poem, it's really most extraordinary. He goes up onto the roof and starts calling to his father. He goes, "Father, we're down here. We moved to Green Street now." Because his father might not know where they live. He goes, "I'm the boy here on the coarse gravel in the flannel shirt, waiting for the apocalypse. I mean, it's just, it is so poignant and beautiful. But I would say he's not especially speaking as a citizen. He's speaking as a son there. He's inhabiting the role of the son, longing for the father and remembering the father that he did not, looking for the father that he did not know. So I would say that in different poems, poets take different positions. And the position of the poet sometimes is as a citizen. But you wouldn't say that when John Clare is writing his poem from the asylum, I Am, that he's writing as a citizen. He's writing as a person who's been locked up for mental illness and feels like that they've thrown away the key and he's been completely forgotten. Yeah. When you'd say that when Edna St. Vincent Millay is writing What Lips My Lips Have Kissed, and writing a sonnet about lost love and feeling old, it's not that she's not a citizen, but she's not speaking as a citizen. So I would say that, to me, that when you're talking about this element of civitas and being pulled towards civitas, that's when the poet is speaking as a citizen in particular.
Beautiful. Ed, because you mentioned Kunitz, and also because I'm still thinking about Rosanna Warren's poem, I don't know if I don't have the clout to be able to twist her arm to read the poem, but if you do, that would be lovely. And then what if we ended with you reading Kunitz?
Great. Rosanna, would you read your poem? She's muted.
Yeah, I'll go get the anthology. It's across the room.
Okay.
I'm honored.
100%, I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry about that.
Good idea. I'm glad you thought of it.
And then the Kunitz, Rosanna's on, if she's looking for it, 341.
Okay, it's a wonderful book. All right.
Beautiful. I'll look for the Kunitz. You're on 341.
Thank you. All right. I will say that this poem is in tremendously good company in this book, on every page of this book. Simile. As when her friend, the crack Austrian skier, in the story she often told us, had to face his first Olympic ski jump, and from the starting ramp over the chute that plunged so vertiginously its bottom lip disappeared from view, gazed on a horizon of Alps that swam and dandled around him like toy boats in a bathtub, and he could not, for all his iron, determination, training, and courage, ungrip his fingers from the railings of the starting gate, so that his teammates had to join in prying up, finger by finger, his hands to free him. So, facing death, my mother gripped the bed rails, but still stared straight ahead. And who was it, finally, who loosened her hands?
So, Rosanna, were you trying to throw us off with the title Simile?
Definitely. Obliquity.
Yeah.
Did I succeed?
It totally works for a while. I mean, when you see simile as
Thanks,
a title,
Eddie.
you think, oh, this is a poem about a literary device. It's about similitude.
Right.
You don't think it's going to be about the death of your mother.
No.
Thank you so much, Rosanna.
Thank you.
You came to receive and you gave us a gift. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you. Eddie's whole book is an extraordinary gift.
So, Rosanna, there's also an epic simile here behind this. And I wonder if you would just be willing to say something about how you got the idea for the poem, because the poem is like, it's all one sentence. It's a hell of a sentence. And it's kind of front loaded. Like most of the poem is about the story that your mother, we find out it's your mother, we don't know, that someone's telling about the skier. And then it leaps into a second stanza and it turns to your experience by your mother's bedside. I wonder if you'd say something about the analogy and how you came to it.
Well, I came to it in the raw experiential way of being with my mother for the several days and nights of her dying, and being in that hyper aware state of seeing and remembering. It felt like everything, including the image of her hands on the bed railing, and I was just flooded at the time with the memory of her telling the story of her friend, the Austrian skier, a story, as the poem says, that she had told the family often. And then I felt a taboo for months that I could not write this as a poem because it was a violation of an intensely private, her private moment, more hers than mine. And yet the image of her hands gripping the bed rails and the image of the Austrian skier with his hands on the starting gate when he couldn't let go just haunted me and haunted me and haunted me. And I kept going back to the notebook where I just jotted these notes, because I keep notebooks just not necessarily for poems, just for life. And then it was the structure of the Homeric simile that finally, I guess, guided me and finally helped persuade me that what I had written, when I just arranged it into the poem, the experience of perception, that it wasn't a violation, but a form of honoring her, as I hoped it was. Does that make sense?
It does. I want to ask you a question since I've got you here, because Linda Gregerson was talking to me about the book this week. Maybe she's been in touch with you about this, but she said, from the story in the first stanza, you can't really tell that the skier actually jumps.
Great point. Linda did write me about this afternoon. It never occurred to me that the skier didn't jump. When his hands were undone, down he goes.
Same with me. I said, like. I think you're overthinking this. She goes, what happens if he doesn't jump? What happens if he's like really turns back and doesn't go? It's even worse. I go, no, that's
I don't think you can do that at the top of us.
Exactly. I go, they're giving him a push. I don't see. His hands are loose. He's going. Right. Linda, you're too much of an intellectual. I just think that you got to jump.
One of our listeners has also helpfully pointed out that the Kunitz is on 3:33, and then we'll wrap before they kick us off because this is too much fun.
We're running out of time. There, by the way, since we're mentioning her, there's an incredible poem by Linda Gregerson in this book called For the Taking, which is about the sexual abuse of her sister. It's really extraordinary poem, and I highly recommend it. So this is Stanley Kunitz's poem, Halley's Comet. I can't resist as a teacher pointing out that the way he catapults himself back into childhood is he starts imitating the language of his younger self. Elizabeth Bishop does something very similar in the waiting room. And she was also from Worcester, and she also in the waiting room is a 3-beat line too. So I say that she's like an older sister standing around behind this poem. Halley's Comet. Miss Murphy in first grade wrote its name in chalk across the board and told us it was roaring down the storm tracks of the Milky Way at frightful speed. And if it wandered off its course and smashed into the earth, there'd be no school tomorrow. A red-bearded preacher from the hills with a wild look in his eyes stood in the public square at the playground's edge, proclaiming he was sent by God to save every one of us, even the little children. Repent, ye sinners, he shouted, waving his hand-lettered sign. At supper, I felt sad to think it was probably the last meal I'd share with my mother and my sisters. But I felt excited too, and scarcely touched my plate. So mother scolded me and sent me early to my room. The whole family's asleep except for me. They never heard me steal into the stairwell hall and climb the ladder to the fresh night air. Look for me, Father, on the roof of the red brick building at the foot of Green Street. That's where we live, you know, on the top floor. I'm the boy in the white flannel gown, sprawled on this coarse gravel bed, searching the starry sky, waiting for the world to end.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was absolutely lovely. And
Thank
thank
you,
you to you
Kim.
all.
Thanks. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Very generous of you both. Good to see everyone.
Good to see
Thank
you.
you, Ed.
Care,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
See you, Rosanna. Goodbye, everyone. Good to see you,
Thank you,
John
Ed.
and
Thank you,
Tiffany.
Frank.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you, Betty. Thank you, Jim.